Between 1987 and 2010, 6 separate crimes were committed that hardly seemed to be connected. But with the development of DNA technology, the police were able to tie most of the crimes to one man and convict one of Denmark's most notorious killers. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome to the 12 Days of Crimelines. We're doing a case from Denmark, which is where my mother-in-law is from, for those who don't know. And I have been there once, spending 2 weeks visiting extended family. It was many years ago. And I've definitely wanted to cover a Danish case for a while. One of the issues is obviously language. The other is the publication of crime stories isn't quite as extensive as it is like in the US, where they release a lot of information. However, this case, the Amager story, is one that was reported on widely, and my research skills have improved greatly over the years to where I really can research stories that happened in other languages and then how to translate them. I'm a lot better about that. If you are a Danish speaker, though, there is a long-form podcast on this case that probably has a lot more details than I will have. It's called Danske Seriemorder, and I'll leave the name in the show notes because you probably couldn't understand my terrible accent there. But it has a lot more information, I'm sure. Unfortunately, my Google Translate abilities does not really make it feasible to translate 6 podcast episodes over. So I did not use it for research, but I did use a Danish documentary called The Copenhagen Killer that I was able to watch with subtitles. So I did get some information from there as well as other sources. They are linked in the show notes. This case starts in the 1980s, but it would take decades to connect all of the crimes and to really bring this case to any type of legal resolution. We are going to start with 73-year-old Edith Andrup, who lived in an apartment in southwest Copenhagen. She was a widow who was comfortable thanks to financial resources, but she was a bit of a homebody. She didn't have a ton of people coming and going from her place, so she proved herself to be a pretty quiet neighbor. On February 17th, 1987, a neighbor noticed there was the smell of gas on the 4th floor. The smell got stronger and stronger until the building superintendent called someone from the gas company to investigate what was going on. It was determined that the gas smell was coming from Edith's apartment. When they approached the door to knock, they could hear the TV through the door because the volume was turned way up. They knocked on the door but got no answer. The building caretaker forced entry, worried that Edith may have been overcome by the fumes. On entry, they could tell the apartment was clearly ransacked, but the first priority was to turn off the stove burners, which were the source of the leaking gas. And they quickly opened up the windows to air out the place. They also saw a small candle burning, so that was blown out. With the immediate risk of explosion eliminated, attention was turned back to the ransacking. Jewelry boxes had been dumped and emptied, drawers and cabinets were wide open and clearly rifled through. Pretty much anything of value that could be carried out was gone. But the most alarming thing was that there was a rug wrapped up on the kitchen floor, and inside of that rolled up carpet was the body of Edith Andrup. She had been strangled with a piece of clothing that was still around her neck, but there was also evidence that the killer had also used his hands to attempt to strangle her. She also suffered from blunt force trauma. Edith's skirt was pulled up, but that appeared to have been because the killer had dragged her body by her legs after death from the living room into the kitchen. There was no sign of a sexual assault. Edith's dinner was found on the table, so it was believed she had been killed the evening before. It looked like after killing Edith that her attacker tried to cover it up by turning up the gas and lighting a candle, hoping to start a fire after he was long gone and safely out of the area. However, after doing some calculations based on how much gas leaked and how long it took someone to notice it, it was determined that the killer had actually left the scene with the stolen goods and then came back several hours later to attempt to start a fire, probably coming back the next day. It would have been pretty risky to return to the scene like that. We've seen plenty of cases where a superficial ransacking was done to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, but that was not the case here. This killer had gone through everything in the apartment, looking for things of value to take. There were 2 clues left at the scene that helped the police narrow in on a person of interest. One was that there was no sign of a break-in. Edith had multiple locks, and the type of people who have multiple locks are the type of people to use them. So either it was someone with a key, or this was someone close enough to Edith that she would have opened the door for them. That made the investigators look at people who knew her. The second clue was a footprint found in 4 places in the apartment, including on a chocolate box that was on the floor. It was estimated to be about a size 43, which is a 12 in men's in the US, or a 10 in UK sizes. It had a pretty specific pattern to the bottom, and it was determined to be a specific Adidas shoe. Those closest to Edith were questioned and soon cleared, but the investigators had another early lead. Edith was downsizing, and she had antique buyers coming by to look at furniture pieces, as well as movers who helped haul things away that had sold. Those would be people who had been in the apartment to know exactly what she had of value in there, and she may have opened the door for one of them if they returned. Maybe they had an excuse about needing to look at another item. The antique buyers were interviewed, as were some of the movers. There was a moving team of 3 men, 2 brothers and a friend of theirs, who had been in the apartment just a month before Edith's murder. The police found out that one of those movers, Marcel Hansen, owned a pair of Adidas shoes with the same tread and a similar size as what was found in the apartment. But Marcel had an alibi. His alibi for the evening of the murder was vague. He said he was home watching TV with his family. But for the time frame when the police thought the killer came back to turn on the stove the next day, his alibi was rock solid. He was working all day, as confirmed by his coworkers and the people he was working for. The police tried to find holes in his story, interviewing him probably half a dozen times, but they couldn't get past his alibi. His explanation was that his shoe prints must have been left in January when he was in the apartment for work. And there was really no way to really prove that this wasn't true, even though it seemed unlikely. Edith hadn't cleaned her floors for a month. But the biggest issue was that these shoes were hardly unique, and literally thousands of pairs had been sold in Denmark. The case eventually went cold. 3 years later, 40-year-old Lena Rasmussen was living in Copenhagen with her partner Karsten. She was a school teacher, and she would usually head home around 3 p.m. On Wednesday, August 29th, 1990, Lena did some grocery shopping after work, dropping the food off at home, and then she headed out for a bike ride to a local nature preserve. She brought her binoculars with her for a little bird watching, which was something she enjoyed. She had seen an eagle in the area recently, and she was hopeful she would catch another peek at it. The area she went bird watching was just about 15 minutes from Edith Andrup's old apartment. Karsten got home from work around 6 as expected, but Lena wasn't home, which he thought she would be. His first assumption was that she had plans or maybe an event at the school that he had forgotten about. Maybe he hadn't really been paying that much attention when she told him about it, so he just made himself some dinner and sat down to watch TV. Evening events at the school, followed by her commute home by train, could have her coming home late, so it wasn't until 10 that Karsten started to worry. He then noticed that her bike was missing from where they stored them and her binoculars were gone, but her purse, he realized, was still at home. Putting all these pieces together, he had a pretty good idea that she probably went out birdwatching, so he went out to where they usually went to look for her. After he couldn't find Lena, he called the police. The authorities started a full search of the area. Of course, the first thought was that there was some type of bike accident and an injury, so hopefully they could find her quickly and get her some help. They had searchers with dogs on the ground and a helicopter searching by air. They focused on nature preserves, and multiple witnesses came forward having seen Lena at the Amager, with Ama being the area they were in, and Fell, which I'm saying wrong, means commons, like a village green. The earliest Lena was seen was around 5 p.m., and the latest sighting was about 6:45. 5 days later, on September 3rd, Lena's bike was spotted. She rode a pretty distinct blue bike, so they knew it was hers. It was up against a tree about 25 yards off of a trail in the nature area, just south of where she had last been seen by witnesses. This gave the police a much more specific area to search. They soon found her binoculars, and an hour and a half after finding her bike and deeper into the woods, Lena's body was found with the help of a police scent dog. It had been covered with ground brush and small branches. Lena's own sweatshirt was tied around her neck and her head, and she had been manually strangled. Initially, the police didn't think this was a sexual assault because Lena was fully dressed and her clothes weren't disturbed like if this was someone who put them back on her after the murder. However, further forensic testing showed that there was semen in her panty liner and on her black shorts. Her partner said they hadn't had sex since the weekend, so it was unlikely to be from him. Now, this attack was in 1990, and it would be about 10 years before DNA technology was to the point where they believed they could test these traces and get a profile, which they did and confirmed that it did not come back to Karsten, her partner. But that was a decade away. Back in 1990, they were having to piece things together without that information. Lena's watch and ring were missing, which could have been a sign that this was also a robbery, but they also had to wonder if these were taken as trophies. As they didn't know the significance just yet, the police did hold this information back from the public. Though Edie and Lena were both killed within 6 miles of each other and they were both strangled, the cases had more dissimilarities than anything else. Edie was in her 70s and Lena was 40. Edie was killed in her home with a robbery being the primary motive, and Lena was killed while out in a nature preserve, and this appeared to be sexually motivated. The cases were not immediately connected, and Lena's case also went cold. Let's go ahead 5 more years to 1995. On December 19th, a man broke into a villa on Amager Island, which is to the east of Copenhagen. Actually, part of Copenhagen is actually on the island, and it is where the airport is. In this villa was a 23-year-old woman who was sleeping on the first floor. She was staying with her sister for a visit, but her sister had already left for work around 5 a.m. The man broke in around 6 and woke the woman up by putting a pillowcase over her head and holding her at knife point. He forced her down into the basement of the home. In the basement apartment lived a 15-year-old girl. That night, her parents were out of town because they were moving an elderly relative into a nursing home, so she decided to invite over 2 friends, 14-year-old twins, to sleep over and keep her company. The girls woke up, one at a time, to the man tying them up. He ordered them to put pillowcases over their heads and not to look at him. Initially, the man just started demanding jewelry and money, so the girl told him where her mother kept things. As he rifled through the apartment, he seemed to calm down, having first come in very agitated. They thought he was nearly done robbing them and the whole ordeal would be over, but then it turned from bad to worse. The man took all 4 victims, one by one, into another room and raped them. He was in the apartment for around 3 hours. Before he left, the man demanded all of their names, the addresses of the victims who didn't live there, and their national ID numbers. He said he needed the information so he could come after them if they went to the police. As they gave this information to him, though, he seemed to be having trouble writing it down. The impression they got was that he was not very good at spelling, and eventually they had to write it down themselves. The attacker then told them to lie down and not to get up before he left, leaving them all alive but deeply traumatized. The oldest, the 23-year-old, managed to get herself free from her restraints. She went to the phone to call for help, but she found the line was dead. The man had cut it. She had to run to a neighbor's house to call the police. This man had taken the 23-year-old's bank card as well as cash, jewelry, and whatever other items of value he could carry out with him. He did make it to 3 or 4 ATMs to withdraw money before the card was locked. The 4 did their best to give the police a description of the man, but no one had seen him for very long. That may honestly be why they were left alive. They hadn't seen enough to identify him. They did say that the man had a Copenhagen accent, specifically sounding like he was from Amager, And based on the banks he went to in Amager, they believe that he was from that area. This incident was not initially tied to the previous two. Like with Edie, a robbery occurred, and like with Alina, there was sexual violence, but he didn't kill them, so it seemed unrelated. An investigation ensued, but the attacker got away. With where DNA technology was at the time, they didn't really have anything with a large enough sample to develop a profile. So now we have to go another 10 years into the future to 2005. A man broke into the apartment of a 24-year-old student at Amager College. The woman was sleeping but woke up at 6 a.m. when she heard someone rummaging through things in the living room. She opened her bedroom door to see a man standing right there. The man forced his way into the bedroom, and for the next 2 hours, he sexually assaulted her while she was blindfolded. After the brutal assault, he forced her to drink a soda and then to take a shower to destroy the biological evidence. It seems the attacker, who would soon become known as the Amager Man, was getting wise to the developments in DNA. He even took her bedsheet with him when he left. When he was gone, she called the police. This time, though, he did make a big mistake. At one point, the victim heard the man go into her kitchen, open the fridge, and then chug something. The police cut the spouts off of all the containers in the fridge, and they were able to develop a DNA profile off of the milk container. The man had also left another clue behind, but it was overlooked at first. In taking prints from around the apartment, they found one on the bathroom door frame, the same bathroom where the victim was ordered to shower. There were other fingerprints on the frame that matched a known friend of the victim's, so they initially thought that the handprint was from that same person. But it was the DNA in this case that brought the cases all together, because when they ran it, they got a hit from the DNA from the murder of Lena Rasmussen. They were looking for a serial offender who they knew at this point had raped and killed one woman and then raped another, but these crimes happened 15 years apart. What was he doing in between these 2 points on the timeline? They looked at other rapes and murders in the area, and the 2000 rape of the 23-year-old and the teen girls was also linked to the same attacker. The problem was they didn't have anyone to match this DNA to. Over the next several years of the investigation, they would test around 200 men with no hits. The next attack occurred on July 22, 2007. A 47-year-old woman had been at a wedding with her husband, but left the reception with a friend around 1:30 in the morning. She had about a kilometer between where she left her friend and her front door. As she walked, alone, a man who had been hiding behind a bush jumped out and grabbed her. He overpowered her and pulled her belt off. He then put it around her neck and forced her to a more discreet area where he raped her. He left her alive, but that may not have been the attacker's initial plan. She had deep bruising to her neck, indicating that he may have attempted to strangle her. Trace DNA was found, but the partial profile was not enough to get any hits. And then the Amager Man struck again for the last time in September 2010. A 17-year-old girl named Mandy, or at least that's the name the media uses for her, was walking home from the metro after a night out. It was either very late at night or very early in the morning, depending on your perspective. Mandy had her headphones on, so she was singing along when she passed a man walking in the opposite direction. Her first thought was a little bit of embarrassment at him hearing her sing. But then she heard the footsteps behind her start coming towards her, and before she could react, the man grabbed her and threw her to the ground. Mandy was terrified, but she thought quickly. She faked an asthma attack, telling him she would die without her inhaler, but he didn't care. Instead, he dragged her to a secluded spot and pulled out a knife, all while she was trying to fight back. She managed to get her cell phone out of her pocket and she dialed home. Her father, Kurt, answered and could hear the commotion. He heard Mandy say, I will not die. I don't want to die," before the line went dead. Kurt ran out trying to find her, but he couldn't. So while Kurt was looking for his daughter over the next 40 minutes, this man raped her. The attacker told Mandy that she had to count to 5,000 before she got up. He then took off, taking the phone and her bag with him. Mandy acted like she was following his orders, counting loudly enough that he could hear her, until she knew he was far enough away, and then she got up and ran home to get help. She and her family then called the police. The police brought out a scent dog to search for evidence, and the dog found a used condom nearby. Mandy said that her attacker had put on a condom prior to the rape because, like I said, he was getting wise to DNA. But in his hurry to get away from the scene, he had dropped it. They were able to pull a full DNA profile, and it was the Amager man. Over the next few months, the police were investigating all of these cases together, hoping the break in one case would lead to the solution to the others. They did find that 2007 rape on the books, and they checked the partial DNA profile in that, and it was consistent with the Amager man, but it was not definitive. In looking at the Lena Rasmussen case, they found that there was a tip that hadn't been followed up on because it never made it from the person being reported to the homicide detectives. But a man had called to say that he saw an old friend from school, Marcel Hansen, at the park that day. They had passed each other, and Marcel in the past had a reputation for being a bully, and now here's a woman ending up dead, so he thought to call it in. Though there were issues getting this tip where it needed to be initially, it did give the police a name to consider. In looking at his past, they found that he had been interviewed in another murder, that of Edith Andrup. He had been the mover. So they have the same name coming up in 2 cold case homicides, and then they were able to connect him to the area of Mandy's rape when they pulled cell phone records from a nearby tower, and it placed Marcel in the area, or at least it placed his phone in the area. Marcel was asked to come into the police station, and they asked him for his prints and his DNA, which he voluntarily complied. His handprint was then matched to the college rape, the one that was on the door frame, and his DNA matched all of the cases where DNA was available. On November 12, 2010, he was then arrested for 1 murder, Lena Rasmussen's, and 2 rapes, the college student and Mandy, and this was just until the others were investigated and those cases were built up. So let's go ahead and talk about who is Marcel Hansen. To start with, he was born in 1965 on Amager Island. He had severe dyslexia, making school very difficult for him. And to compensate for initially being picked on for his learning disability, Marcel decided to be tougher than everyone else. He was, in a word, a bully. It seems like there may have been something else behind his violent behavior than trying to appear tough, because he also appeared remorseless, once shooting sharpened arrows at other children. He started partying in his teen years, often ruining everyone's good time by fighting. Marcel quit school by the time he was 16, and he took a job with his brother as a mover. But the main way he would make money was selling stolen goods. He had enough friends who were fences, so he would do the stealing and they would buy and sell for him. In 1983, during the robbery of an old woman, Marcel and his friends gained entry by claiming they were police officers. After she opened the door, he attacked her, hitting her in the head with a club. Then he tied her up as they robbed the place. The thing with Marcel's violence was that even the criminals he surrounded himself with thought he was outrageous, and they actually prevented him from hurting this woman even more. She was not a threat to him. He did not need to meet her with that much violence. Like Edith Andrup, Marcel had met this woman when he helped move her things. As the years passed, Marcel seemed to, from the outside, calm down. He was working at the airport, cleaning planes overnight, and he was a well-respected soccer coach who specifically reached out to at-risk youth. Soccer had been the only thing he was good at, and it's where he shined even when he was getting himself in trouble in other areas of his life. He had settled down with his girlfriend, and they had 2 kids. After about 20 years together, though, Marcel and his girlfriend split up in 2007, and he moved into his own place. The people who knew Marcel from his younger days were not surprised at his arrest. They knew he had been violent, and often for no apparent reason other than he enjoyed it. But those who knew him as a dad and a soccer coach were so shocked that when people told them about his arrest, they thought they were joking around. With Marcel's DNA, they went back to the 2007 rape that had that trace amount of DNA. Using a new technique, well, new in 2010, they focused on the Y chromosome, and they could not rule Marcel out. But unlike the 1 in a million or 1 in a billion results, this one was 1 in 2,200. Seeing as there are 600,000 people in Copenhagen and well over 5 million in Denmark, it was hardly a slam dunk. But with the patterns from the other attacks, the prosecutors hoped they had enough to prove that he had attacked that woman as well. All told, when Marcel finally went to trial, he was being charged with 2 murders and 7 rapes, and he was also charged with attempted arson for his gas and candle setup at Edith's apartment. The trial began in December of 2011, and days later, the prosecution actually got more evidence that they didn't expect, courtesy of a tip. Marcel's oldest son's girlfriend came forward to the police. She had found 4 letters from Marcel to his son, along with a sealed tip of a rubber glove. The letters laid out a plot Marcel had come up with to get out of jail. Basically, he wanted his son to knock out a woman and plant Marcel's semen on her to look like someone with Marcel's DNA had raped her. Since he was in prison and couldn't have done it, it would prove that someone else was out there attacking women who happened to have the same exact DNA profile that he did. He didn't want his son to actually kill anyone, but just do what he had to help Marcel's defense. Now, how was his son going to get his semen? Marcel used the fingertips of rubber gloves as a transport to smuggle his semen out. A search of the home found 6 more letters outlining the plan and additional rubber glove fingertips. They tested the semen, and it was a match to Marcel. His son, however, tried to defend his father. He said that the semen was actually his, and he had forged the letters from his father. He had left all of this out to see if he could trust his girlfriend to be loyal. And obviously, she failed the test because she had gone to the police. But DNA does not lie, and it seems like the 23-year-old just believed his father was innocent and was trying to help him. But these letters and such were not all that was found on the search of his son's home. The police also found jewelry given to him by Marcel that matched what was taken from the quadruple rape. Because the prosecutors believed he knew where the jewelry came from, the son was also charged. The evidence against Marcel was primarily the DNA, which was not present in every case. But finding his son with the goods stolen from one of the scenes really helped. As for the murder of Edith Andrup, there were a few hurdles the prosecution still had to overcome. One was that the shoe print was hardly unique, and the other main reason was that Marcel had an alibi for when the police believed the gas leak started. So the prosecution had to dismantle their own police evidence to prove that it was possible that Marcel went to the apartment at a different time to try to start the fire or set off an explosion. They did have a witness who heard Marcel confess to the murder, saying that he did it to see if he could live with himself after killing someone, and it turned out he could. As for Marcel's defense to everything, he didn't do it. His attorney said Marcel was willing to speak with the police and provide his DNA, and he stuck around until he was arrested. If he was guilty or knew the DNA would match, surely he would have put up more of a fight. Marcel did answer questions in court, and he had some vague answers, but those are explained by his attorney. It was more evidence he was innocent. It's hard to give answers about something you have no knowledge of. And some of these charges were so old that Marcel obviously couldn't remember what he was doing that day or where he was. The defense also jumped on the descriptions given of the attacker in the quadruple rape. The prosecutor said that their vague descriptions were consistent with Marcel, but when I call these descriptions vague, I mean the descriptions were vague, like he had straight hair. They didn't really have anything specific that would match Marcel and not anyone else. Moreover, the defense said Marcel was a very heavy smoker, yet no one, not one of the victims, said that their attacker smelled of smoke. But getting over that DNA evidence was going to be much harder, or getting over the fact that jewelry from the home of 4 victims was in the possession of Marcel's son. In the end, 46-year-old Marcel Hansen was found guilty on all charges except for the 2007 rape that was due to lack of conclusive evidence. He was then sentenced to life in prison. Afterwards, he made a public statement insisting on his innocence and saying that the person who really committed the crime must be a psychopath who hated women, which didn't describe him. However, Marcel did not appeal. Marcel was then charged and found guilty of conspiracy to commit attempted rape for trying to get his son to attack someone for him, but he was not given any additional time. Marcel was already serving the maximum sentence allowed under Danish law. However, this offense could be used against him at future parole hearings. All life sentence inmates are given a parole hearing after 12 years, but the average prison duration of a life sentence is 16 years. However, the longest serving inmate served 33. Given the number of attacks in this case, it seems like Marcel is very likely to be one of those inmates who serves more than the average amount of time. As of the last news report I could find, Marcel Hansen has maintained his innocence and has refused all rehabilitative programs that have been offered to him. The Danish prison system is built on reforming offenders, and their prisons are very unlike the ones we have in the U.S. Inmates work a full-time job while in prison, they make meals, and they live a life very similar to the outside world, just with major freedom restrictions. The idea is that if life in prison mimics the outside world versus being more like an institution, the people will later be able to re-enter society without as many issues. And I think this is something that here in the U.S. should give us something to think about, because in the U.S., the recidivism rate is 52%. It's only 27% in Denmark, so they may be onto something. Due to the focus on rehabilitation, though, those who are resistant to those efforts will have a hard time getting parole, which is probably a relief to the women of Copenhagen, so long as Marcel Hansen refuses to cooperate and stays locked up. In the meantime, people are wondering if Marcel Hansen had more victims. Because of the span of time Marcel was actively attacking people, he almost surely had more rape victims than we know about. It's possible they were just not able to link them through forensics, or possibly some of the attacks were just not reported. The statute of limitations for any of those unknown rapes has expired. As for murder, though, there is no statute of limitations, and there are a few unsolved murders that have been investigated for links to Marcel Hansen. They've been investigated both by the police and by journalists. Former police officer and current investigative journalist Sebastian Rikkelsen has been working on this case. I think of him as Denmark's Josh Hallmark. He does the same work Josh does on the Israel Keys case, but instead with Marcel Hansen. He is the host of the Danske Seriemorder, that podcast, and also the 3-part documentary, The Copenhagen Killer, that I watched with subtitles on Apple TV. 2 cases Sebastian really thinks could be the work of Marcel Hansen are the Annette Olsen case and the Anastina Geisler case. Stina, as she was known by her friends, was an 18-year-old who was almost done with high school. On June 4th, 1990, 2.5 months before Lena Rasmussen's murder, she was in downtown Copenhagen with her friends for the Whitsun Carnival. Around 2:30 in the morning, she left to go home. It's believed that as Stina was entering her apartment building, an assailant grabbed her and forced her to the basement area of a nearby restaurant. Stina had been tied up with an electrical cord around her wrists, with the cord then snaking up around her neck. If she moved or tried to force herself free from the restraints, she would end up strangling herself. Stina's body was found the next day by restaurant workers. She had 2 rags stuffed into her mouth, and it's likely she suffocated. The case, in some ways, like proximity and bringing her to a basement, are similar to Marcel's crimes. He was also known to tie people up when he robbed them. But there were other things that were dissimilar. On autopsy, a scratch was found on Stina's arm. It wasn't really a scratch so much as like a mark that was carved into her arm. Some think it looks like PK and others think it is AV. So if we're thinking about this as though Marcel had done it, what could that symbol mean? Sebastian Rickelson thinks that it could actually stand for West Ama, which is where Marcel was from, and it's a common tag for people in his circle to graffiti. Because of his severe dyslexia, depending on the position of Stina's arm when the mark was made, he may have juxtaposed the letters. There are other suspects in that case, and Marcel cannot be ruled out by any of the information that has been made public. The other case was 28-year-old Annette Olsen, who was killed just about a week before Lena Rasmussen. On August 21st, 1990, Annette was walking home from visiting her mother around 11 p.m. We do have 2 witnesses here. There were 2 teens outside of her apartment building. Annette let herself in, and the teens saw a man follow up behind her and go into the building. They heard a scuffle, a woman yell, "He has a knife," and then a short struggle before the man ran back out of the building. When they ran inside to see what happened, they found Annette covered in blood. She had been stabbed 28 times. When paramedics arrived, she was still conscious but possibly incoherent because when she was asked what happened, she said something about it was criminal, but they could talk about it later. She died in the hospital an hour after this, never saying anything more that we know of. The police believe that Annette knew her killer due to the rage he showed and the lack of any other apparent motive. There was no robbery or sexual assault. The man just ran in, stabbed her, and ran out. Since Annette was a lesbian and the attacker was a man, it's not like they could just go down a list of ex-boyfriends to find a motive. But when Sebastian Rickelson looked into it, he learned that Annette had recently spent time at Famu Island at a feminist camp. Marcel, though he was obviously not at the women-only camp, was on the island within that time frame. As people had to go into town for food and supplies, it was possible Annette and Marcel crossed paths, and how that would translate into a motive for murder is just frankly speculation at this point. If there are more victims and more answers that could be had, I hope the evidence is found. And in the meantime, Marcel Hansen looks like he is staying right where he belongs, which is behind bars.